Tell me if you want me to adjust it some. You want me to point it? You want me to point it down a little more?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming out on a rainy night. For what I'm sure will be worth the effort. We are here with celebrating Howard Fishman's recent book, To Anyone Who Has Ever Asked, The Life, Music, and Mystery of Connie Converse. Here's the book, which we have stacked up on a table by the front counter. So afterwards, you can pick up a copy if you haven't already, and we'll do a book signing following this. How many people before tonight had heard of Connie Converse? Okay, very good. All right, great. Anyway, Howard Fishman is a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, where he has published essays on music, film, theater, literature, and culture. His bylines have appeared in The New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Telegraph, Vanity Fair, The Washington Post, Art Forum, Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, Mojo, The Village Voice. His play, A Star Has Burnt My Eye, was a New York Times critics pick. As a performing songwriter and band leader, he has toured internationally as a headlining artist for over 2 decades. He has released 11 albums to date and is the producer of the album Connie's Piano Songs, The Art Songs of Elizabeth Connie Converse. A former New Orleans resident, he is now based in New York, and a resident and performer here too, right? Yes. Stuart Hall is here to be in conversation with Howard, and he is from Poughkeepsie, New York, in Hudson Valley. He was raised on the music and activism of Pete Seeger and the band near Bard College until he left home at 18. Fired from and rehired to multiple radio stations in his almost 30 years career, most notably WDST in Woodstock, WKZE in Red Hook, New York, and now WWOZ as host of The Fourth Dimension, which is airing at midnight tonight. And I better hurry up after this. And most Tuesday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m., the morning set. Stuart is also the director of operations at Marigny Opera House. So now I get to step out of the way and turn it over to the professionals here who will take it from here.
Thank
you.
All right, nice to see so many faces out there. I'm Stuart Hall, if you hadn't gathered. Howard Fishman, to my left here. Howard and I both lived in New Orleans back in early 90s at the same time, but we didn't know each other back then. We were just discussing that. I wasn't in radio yet, and Howard was playing on the streets in the clubs of New Orleans at that time. We did meet in the Hudson Valley. I used to promote music, and that's when we first met on the wheels of your first record. The Howard Fishman Quartet, I believe it was titled. Yeah. And since then, that was probably about 25 years ago.
1999.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've kept in contact, and he was a writer of a different ilk then, and so we put on some shows, and now this. This incredible subject, Connie Converse. And who the hell is Connie Converse was my first reaction to that. And then the music came out, and the music stands on its own. You can listen to the tracks and become intrigued immediately. But then there's the story, and the story is wild, and the story is, it touches on so many things, activism and feminism and depression. And so Connie Converse, as I know it, was born into a very strict Baptist upbringing. And so, you know, I was brought up in a religious upbringing. They're still very religious, my family, and so rebellion follows suit for a lot of people. And so, I guess let's begin with what is it that made you? I mean, it's one thing to become interested in the subject, but what made you decide to devote 12 years into writing a book about Connie Converse?
Yeah, great question. And maybe a good place for me to, I usually when I do these things, I read like a page and a half out of this.
Yeah. And
that's kind of a good setup for the reading, so if people don't mind, maybe I will do that, and then we'll get into the conversation a little bit more. And the only setup that I need to do for the reading is that in 2010, I was at a holiday party in Brooklyn, New York, and I was having some social anxiety, so I was studying the books on the bookshelves and listening to the music that was being played and the playlist that was being played, and then a song came up. And this is the song, which I think we can play on this boombox here. And if you know Connie Converse, you probably already know it, but if not, here she is.
In between two tall mountains, there's a place they call lonesome. Don't see why they call it lonesome. I'm never lonesome when I go there. See that bird sitting on my windowsill, ready saying whippoorwill all the night through. See that brook running by my kitchen door, but it couldn't talk no more if it was you. Up that tree, there's sort of a squirrel thing. Sounds just like it did when we were quarreling. In the yard, I keep a pig or two. They drop in for dinner like you used to do. I don't stand in the need of company with everything I see talking like you. Up that tree, that sort of a squirrel thing. Sounds just like we did when we were quarreling. You may think you left me all alone, but I can hear you talk without a telephone. I don't stand in the need of company with everything I see talking like you. See that bird sitting on my windowsill, and he's saying whippoorwill all the night through, just whippoorwill all the night through. In between two tall mountains, there's a place they call lonesome. Don't see why they call it lonesome. I'm never lonesome now I live there.
So I was only half paying attention to the music until this song came on. And the song came on, and the party completely disappeared. I had the feeling that I knew this song like it was something I known all my life, and I also realized I don't know this song. And I found the host, and I asked who we were listening to, and he said, oh, this is Connie Converse. She never made any professional recordings. She was around in the 50s in Greenwich Village. She recorded herself in her apartment. She never had any kind of success, and then one day she drove away and disappeared and was never heard from again. And what we just listened to is one of those home recordings that she made in the 50s and a compilation of them has just come out on a little label called How Sad, How Lovely. And I went home that night and I picked up the record on the way home. I went back to my apartment, I started listening to it. I got online because I needed to know who this person, Connie Converse, was and to know more information, only to find there was no information about Connie Converse. Zero. The only information that existed was in the liner notes, and the liner notes were very incomplete. There was some talk, I'll mention it in the reading about what the liner notes say, but the internet came to a dead stop when you looked up Connie Converse. There were no reviews of her performing, no listings of her performing from back then, obviously no recordings, no obituary, nothing about a disappearance. It almost was like this person doesn't really exist. Like this must be somebody like pulling a hoax. But then I latched onto something that proved to me that no, okay, this person really did exist. A little detail that's not really important right now, but started me on this quest. So I'm just going to read from the very beginning of this very long book about Connie Converse, which is what I was thinking when I was just discovering this music. Who was this woman? Why had this music been ignored? What happened to her? The liner notes to her album had it that Converse had been born in New England and had come to New York City after college. She lived there during her years of music making, producing her own recordings of her compositions, songs that drew from varied strains of older American music, but that did not belong exclusively to any of them and did not fit into current trends. Though she briefly flirted with mainstream exposure, she didn't manage to break through, mostly, I presumed, because her music was neither fish nor fowl, and the music industry hadn't known what to do with her. She had tried her luck in New York for about a decade before giving up in despair of ever finding a larger audience. She never married, never had kids, was never known to have a significant other of any kind, and then, in middle age, she disappeared. Like the old Twilight Zone episode about the shut-in actress who watches the same film over and over again by herself until finally she steps into the picture and becomes part of its plot, I couldn't stop listening to Connie Converse. Couldn't not identify with her story or the issues I guessed might be part of it. I knew the fickle nature of the music business and what it felt like to be both courted and then pushed away. Like most professional artists, I knew the indignities involved in trying to sell unguarded personal expression to a marketplace and the attendant embarrassment when met with rejection or apathy. I too was crossing into middle age, unmarried, childless, living alone in a small apartment in New York City. I also had recently begun to wonder whether radical change was a viable option. As I now sat in that dark, cramped apartment with the album How Sad, How Lovely on repeat, a strange thing began to happen. By the album's third track, Roving Woman, a generally witty, lighthearted tune, I became gripped by the kind of overwhelming discomposure that can arrive when we hear, for example, a beloved song from our childhood, or one that reminds us of a first love, or of some other pivotal moment in our lives. Music can have this power to transport us back in time, reminding us of what it felt like to be extraordinarily happy, or hopeful, or cared for, or free, a phenomenon that is sometimes accompanied in our minds by a cinematic series of scenes, memories, and faces, all now gone for good. Yet Converse's music was completely new to me. Why was it having this effect? Why did her songs, her words, the tone of her voice leave me pacing the floor, wanting to know more about her, even on more than one occasion beset by episodes of unexplainable sobbing? The confluence of hearing her songs, of reading about her tragic story, and of empathizing with her situation led to an emotional reckoning I hadn't seen coming. In Connie Converse, I heard the sound of every artist who's ever been ignored or rejected because their work was too personal, too idiosyncratic, too unmarketable. I heard Buddy Bolden's cornet, lost for all time, but for a rumored Edison cylinder, the holy grail of jazz recordings. I heard arias from Scott Joplin's Lost Opera, A Guest of Honor, the voices of the people in Mike Disfarmer's photographs, and the unknown other performances by Gishi Wiley. I heard the now-forgotten spirit of Susan Glaspell and the unfinished plays of Eugene O'Neill, torn up and burned at the end of his life, and Barbara Loden's unmade adaptation of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. I heard the dark American soul of Albert Pinkham Ryder and Thelonious Monk and Charles Birchfield and Son House and Vivian Maier. I heard the entirety of America's forgotten cultural history. In Connie Converse, I heard a woman reaching out across time and space to be understood, to locate her fellows, others who, perhaps like her, found mainstream American mores insulting and intolerable. And like anyone who encounters these kinds of artistic expressions, who also knows what it feels to be apart, outside, alone, I heard myself, only better. To say that I became obsessed would be imprecise. Obsession, I think, implies at least some degree of choice, and I didn't feel that I had any of that. Connie Converse seized me, the way that some are seized by unsolved mysteries like the JFK assassination, or the lost colony of Roanoke, or the life of Caspar Hauser. In short order, I stopped writing my own music and became devoted only to Connie Converse, to learning more about her, to piecing together her life, to spreading the gospel of her particular brand of genius everywhere and every how I could, to eventually inserting myself into the life she left behind, to the point that, at times, I felt I'd become part of the plot.
Well, that answers that question.
12 years later, the book.
Yes. In that, you have become of service to her and her life, and I guess to countless readers too. And so that's a new purpose. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've become a champion for this overlooked woman. Not because I felt there was not that there was any ego involved with that, because nobody else was doing it.
Mm-hmm. A story that needed to be told.
Yeah.
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 So I guess what I was getting at was this. She grew up with this sort of strict family, and then moved to New York, started smoking and drinking, and hanging out with some folks, and some real changes, and changed her name, who was Elizabeth Eaton Converse, and now became Connie Converse. And you were talking about empathy. Who among us hasn't thought, I'll just disappear?
Yeah.
But she actually did. So that's fascinating to me. That
Yeah. She did disappear in 1974. I'm assuming most people here have not read the book, correct? Okay, that's fine. She disappeared in 1974, and people, that's the first question that I get asked. Maybe second question, sometimes people will say, why Connie Converse, or what does her music sound like? But very soon they want to know, well, what do you mean she disappeared? People don't just disappear. The book is not, I did not spend, the focus of the book is not the disappearance. It's not a true crime book. I was more interested in the person and the life that she led and the things that she accomplished in her life than in solving the mystery of her disappearance. That said, and without giving anything away, because I do talk about the disappearance in the book, when Connie Converse disappeared, it wasn't a slow fade to black and then she was gone. It was like blackout. She drove away one day in her car. The end. Nothing was ever heard of her again. Her car was never found. Body was never found. That was it. And she could be alive right now. She'd be 99 and a half. It's unlikely. But yeah, the mystery was never solved. But yes, what Stuart just said is true. Some of us have that impulse. We want to eject ourselves from our lives, or we have a fantasy of ejecting ourselves to our lives, to another country, to another situation, another job, whatever it is. Connie Converse had a habit of doing this. She didn't just do it when she disappeared. She ejected herself from her hometown of Concord, New Hampshire, never went back. She got a full ride scholarship to Mount Holyoke College, and inexplicably left after her second year and disappeared for 9 months, during which time I wasn't able to find any evidence of her whereabouts at all. And then in 1961, she ejected herself from New York, where she'd lived for 15 years, moved to Ann Arbor without any explanation. She told friends in New York, I'm just going on a sabbatical, I'll be back, and never returned to New York. So this was a habit of hers, of pressing restart and sort of erasing what came before.
Yeah. So now they all know what I know. What is available about the Connie Converse up until this book. So that makes the fact finding all the more difficult.
Yes. Well, when I Googled her, I think there was already a Wikipedia page, because the album had been out for almost a year. So somebody had made a Wikipedia page, but it was essentially a regurgitation of the information that was in the liner notes, and it was very scant. There was hardly anything there. So much of the work that I did for these 12 years involved finding and tracking down and sometimes pinning down people from her life, people that knew her, and going to interview them, and oftentimes calling them and saying, I'm sorry to call you out of the blue, my name is Howard Fishman, I'm a writer and a musician, and I'm writing about somebody you know, Connie Converse, the musician. And they would say, who? And I would say, Connie Converse. And they would say, are you talking about Elizabeth Converse? And I would say, yes. And they would say, she didn't play any music. Because most of the people that knew her, that I was able to find who were still alive, were people that knew her after she left New York, and she didn't tell any of them about her music career in New York. So yes, the research was intense and like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and it was all first-hand research. I mean, there was nothing available about her. So it was breaking new ground everywhere I went, which was exciting, but also very frustrating at times, and took a long time.
So the recordings, what we just heard, is that a part of the Gene Deitch recordings that were made? Gene Deitch was a cartoonist and a friend of Elizabeth, and recorded her one afternoon in his kitchen in the 50s.
Yeah, the way that she had a brush with fame. She almost got famous. This guy Gene Deitch was a well-connected animator and illustrator in New York, and he would have salons at his house in Hastings-on-Hudson, just north of New York in Westchester County. And he would invite musicians to come and give house concerts and record them. And Connie Converse was one of those people that made it to his house. He recorded her. Somehow the tape that was made, one song of which you just heard, made it into the hands of the CBS Morning Show, a television variety show hosted by a young Walter Cronkite. And Connie Converse, without having any recordings to her name, without having any concert engagements lined up to promote, was invited onto television to play songs and talk to Walter Cronkite. And there's no recording that or film of that appearance, but there are still photographs that are included in the book. And it's another of many head scratchers of this woman's story. Like, how did this happen, and how did she present herself, and what did she play, and
And the research takes you to her brother.
Right. Okay. So, and maybe I feel like I'm talking so much, and I want to have more of a conversation. But yes, after I was having these kind of fits in my apartment, listening to Connie Converse, and realizing that I needed to do something to draw attention to this woman's music, I emailed her brother, who was still living in Michigan, who was the person that she was living with when she disappeared. And I wrote to him and I said, I'm sorry for bothering you. I'm completely overwhelmed by the beauty of your sister's music. I hope this email you don't find this disturbing or upsetting to talk about, but I would love to do some more to get recognition for this music. And he wrote back to me within an hour and said, I would be happy to talk with you. You know, the details of this very sad story happened a long time ago. We're well over it as a family, and I'm happy to do anything that would be helpful for whatever it is you have in mind. And I began emailing him and calling him on an almost daily basis, asking him different questions. And finally he said, Howard, why don't you just come to Ann Arbor and spend a weekend here with me and my wife? We have all of Connie's stuff. It's in the garage. So I got on a plane and I went to Michigan and I went to his house and we went into his garage, and in the garage was a filing cabinet that she had left behind, a 5-drawer metal filing cabinet. In that filing cabinet, which had a 9-page single-space typed table of contents that she had left, what was in every drawer, what was in every folder, was the curated, considered output of an incredible life. It was music, photographs, hundreds of letters, illustrations, lectures, academic papers, activism work, a children's book that she had written, part of an opera she was working on, poetry, a study in statistics that involved like an early version, it seems, of like what tagging is today with Pandora and Spotify. Like she was doing these things by hand. I mean, there's a lot that I could get into, that we could get into, talking about the various things that Connie Converse did. But she was so much more than, even if she was just a musician and had composed just these songs, she would be worthy of a book this size. But oh my God, she did so much, and none of it was recognized. And she left it all behind for somebody like me to find. And so it was in that moment, looking through that filing cabinet, that I realized, oh my God, this is a book, and there's no turning back.
Yeah, up until that point, I'm thinking the scarcity is the operative word. The music itself is raw, and there's some scarcity to it, and it's very simple. And then her story, who is she? We don't know. And then you come across this thing provided by her family, and
yes, and the wrinkle to this story of the filing cabinet is that, on the one hand, yes, she left all this for somebody to discover one day, hopefully. On the other hand, looking through that 9-page table of contents, on every page there were items that were crossed out with a single line, and next to that line it said dumped. And these were not things that she threw away. These were things that her brother had gotten rid of. So the mystery deepened.
So he wrote dumped, not she.
Yes.
What kind of things were they?
What?
What kind of things were they? Were they too personal or family related?
Well, we don't know because they're gone.
Right.
But things like, what she called my early literary experiments, diary entries, things that were, they weren't like, old bills. Significant biographical material was just gone, and he'd gotten rid of it. Yeah.
How do you deal with that in the book? Or do you?
Yeah, I deal with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I say, I'm assuming most people haven't read the book, so I don't want to give things away. But these are some of the driving mysteries and behind this.
But she had a lot of music for piano.
Yes.
And who published this?
Right. So she also wrote, along with these guitar songs, she wrote an entire catalog of art song for classical voice and piano. And before I'd gotten out there to Ann Arbor, Phil had told me about these pieces. And he said, "Oh, we have copies if you want to see them." And I said, "Yeah." So he FedExed me this big sheaf of her manuscripts of these incredible art songs of a completely different character musically. And I started working with a singer and a pianist in New York on bringing those to light, and we produced an album called Connie's Piano Songs. And I think most people, for as few people that know Connie Converse's songs, even fewer know the piano stuff. I mean, it's like hardly anybody knows that stuff yet. But of the people that do and the people that know about that world of music, it seems likely that in time she will come to be known for that stuff as well, if not more than the guitar stuff. It's simply stunning. Yeah, thanks for that question, Natasha.
Does anybody else out there have something on your mind?
I was just trying to picture that moment where you're in her brother's house.
Yeah.
And he's sharing all these, it sounds like he's very welcoming, and then you look at the table of contents and you're like, oh, why does it say jumped? What was that moment like? I imagine a little bit awkward, or was he like, yeah, I'm going to just throw a bunch of stuff away?
Well, I didn't notice it right away. I was there for a long weekend, and there was also a student from the New School in New York who was with me, who was making a short documentary about her. And she was looking through the stuff too. And she had an assistant with her. And at some point, I don't know if it was the first day or the second day, but one of us noticed that, and we were like, wait a minute, what's all this stuff that was dumped? And I remembered the student saying, like, I don't think we should ask Phil about that. Like, we can't put him on the spot. And I said, what are you talking about? We have to ask him. And they were like, well, you ask him. So, yeah, that conversation did happen during that weekend. And
So you'll ask him.
Yeah, it's in the book. Yeah. I don't want to take too much away from the book. But yeah, Maggie.
I just wanted to say that I have read the book.
I know you have. Thank you.
And I was actually on the waiting list to read it. It's been finished or published. And but just like listening to you talk about her, Howard, makes me want to cry. Really, for her life, you know, that it is a magnificent book. You're definitely not giving too much away.
Okay.
And the story is so evocative, and it has so many, you know, tendrils, and that just sort of like wrap you up in it, you know, the reader, in much the same way that you felt hearing her music.
Yeah.
Firsthand, and that I mean, I've known Howard a long time. I've been a fan of his music a long time, and so like I think you are. I don't even know where I'm fucking going. I think you're an ideal person to carry her work and her heart forward. Is really what I want to say.
Thank you. And what Maggie says about, I mean, for the people that haven't read the book, it's not a straight biography. It is part biography, but it's also part kind of detective story, and then my own kind of obsession, and also a lot of musical analysis and looking at the stuff that she did. So yeah, it's not. The book started as a cradle-to-grave biography with none of that other stuff in it. I couldn't sell that book. No publisher would touch it. And then working with my agent, I started inserting myself into the narrative. and that was the trick. And then Dutton Book said, yeah, we want that book. Yeah.
So I have a publishing question
Sure.
and a mystical question.
Yeah.
So I'd rather, the mystical is much more exciting to me, but I am curious about the publishing. So
Sure.
How much time into it were you before a publisher agreed, or before this story happened? And then the mystical question is, did you feel like you were channeling Connie, and do you feel comfortable, and maybe this is part of the book, but do you feel comfortable talking about conversations that you had with Connie's spirit?
Well, I'll answer your questions in order. The publishing question is, I knew, I think so I wrote this play about her called A Star Has Burned My Eye, and that got performed in New York while I was doing all this research. And I was well into the idea that I was writing a book, but I'd never published a single thing in my life. So the idea that I could put out a book, and not only a book, but a biography, seemed like a tall order. And I started asking around to people that I knew in the publishing world, and the advice that I got from one person was, you need to write a magazine piece about her and get it placed. And then that will start to generate interest, and you can then leverage that maybe into a book deal, or at least get some people, because nobody knows who Connie Converse is, so nobody's going to publish this book. So I wrote to a friend who had championed my Connie Converse play at the New Yorker, and I said, I've written a piece, I don't know where to publish it, can you give me some ideas? And she said, well, why don't you send me the piece and I'll give you some ideas. And I sent it to her, and she said, I'm actually going to show this to my editor at the New Yorker, and the New Yorker published it. So my first piece was published by the New Yorker, which was not a bad way to start. And then from there I started writing more for the New Yorker and for other publications, and gradually over those years, from about 2016 to when the book sold in 2020, I wrote a ton of stuff, and got some credibility, and was able to sell the book. Your second question, there's something inexplicable that happens to me when I hear Connie Converse's music, and when I think about her, when I read her letters, when I talk about her. I don't know, I can't explain it. I haven't actually ever had a conversation with her, but I do feel that somehow there's something going on that is beyond my understanding, and I just feel like that's why I felt powerless when I first started hearing the music to do anything but be of service to her. Like, it was just like I got chosen to do that. I don't know why, but I never questioned it. Yeah.
I have a musical question.
Great.
I'm curious to know what impact your obsession with and love for her music has had on your own music. Has she affected it?
I get asked that question a lot, and I don't have a good answer for it, except to say that one of the things that I love so much about Connie Converse's music is that it, and I never know if I'm saying this right, it's sui generis, is that how you say that term? There's nothing else that sounds like her. And so I love that, and that has always been what I've tried to do with my music, is not to try to make it unique, but also not try to make it like anything else. So if anything, she was sort of like, when I found her, it was sort of like validation for what I had been doing musically for a long time, which is just not to care about style and genre and cookie cutter music and just play what I felt, and it seemed like that's what she was doing. So yeah, it was more confirmation.
Kind of a kindred spirit thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like she was the best version of what I could ever hope to do. Like, way better than anything I could do. Yeah. Is that rain?
Rain.
No. Yeah.
I guess mine is more like a behavioral question. From the information I heard, it sounds like perhaps she was a Mensa.
Perhaps she was what?
A Mensa, with that intellect. And I don't know if that's something that, from the plethora of work, it sounds like she explored. If that might be something that she may have been. And behavioral, do you think she might have had multiple personalities?
Well, I talked to a lot of psychologists about her, and everybody says that, you can't diagnose somebody that's not a hearer. So it's all speculation. But clearly, she seemed to be what we now call neurodivergent in many, many ways. She was a real outsider and did not follow any of the prompts that were given to women at that time. She wanted nothing to do with prompts. And that caused her to be a little bit off-putting and abrasive to some people. And she didn't care. Yeah, she's a fascinating study, and I feel like somebody with that sort of background could write a whole book about Connie Converse's, psychology. But yeah, we can't diagnose her from this vantage point unless she comes back.
Well, just know that the relationship you cultivated with her brother, if there was any kind of thing that he said, like as a child, she might have exhibited some behavior like that.
The relationship with her brother is so complicated and intense, and it is threaded throughout the book. He was her self-described greatest champion. If it weren't for him, the recordings that she made and the filing cabinet, the things in the filing cabinet that were left behind would not, we wouldn't know who she was if it wasn't for her brother Phil Converse. That's clear. But also his complicated relationship to her as a sister, as a woman, as an artist, as a fellow thinker, was very, very fraught and kind of troubling.
By all accounts, she was very kind to people and a good listener. And more speculation. Do you think she was just gritting her teeth rather than smiling? Or...
No. In fact, the people that knew her well, and even those that didn't know her well, would say that she would never let anybody feel stupid. She was always interested in what anybody had to say, and was always interested in honoring that and holding space for it. And it made her a very comfortable person to be with and talk with if you were present. If you weren't present, if you had other what's the word I want? If you had other motives, or if you were pretending, or if you wanted her to be something she wasn't, she didn't suffer fools. Agenda, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah.
So, it was interesting to hear that you hadn't actually published anything. I mean, you've written plays and music, but hadn't published, so you kind of went from 0 to 50 pretty quickly. In terms of doing the interviews with people, what was that process like for you? How did you know what to ask? Where did that come from?
Well, I would bring in notes, and I would use the voice recorder on my phone and sit down with people and just start to talk to them. Tell me what you remember about Elizabeth. Where did you meet her? What, paint the picture for me. The first time you saw her, what did it feel like? What were your impressions of her? How did she change over time? When was the last time you saw her? What were the kinds of things that you talked about? Do you remember her drinking and her smoking, which everybody talked about. She smoked 3 to 4 packs a day and was a heavy drinker. Yeah, I mean, I had my standard list of questions, and then I would always just try to leave it as the trick, like the Robert Caro trick, is let them talk. Don't interrupt them, and don't start a new question until you're really sure they're done. Just keep your mouth shut. Like, that's what I learned from reading Robert Caro's advice to writers. So that's what I tried to do. Just ask open-ended questions and then keep my mouth shut.
Have you finished that thought?
Very good.
I was also concerned about or thinking about the research when it comes to activism and her fight against racism, which she called white racism, and you know, there's so many famous people we adore now who were you know, mentioned in the Un-American Committee, but Joe McCarthy and had their lives turned upside down.
Yeah.
What's that part of history with her in 1974 or before?
Oh, well, when she first came to New York, she came to New York to be a writer and not a musician. And she got work working for the American Institute of Pacific Relations, which is a now completely obscure, forgotten organization, but back then was a hugely significant, important think tank that was thinking about at the end of World War II, the world was being reorganized politically, and the AIPR was at the center of it, working with getting the United Nations in place, working with relationships in the Far East, scholars and thinkers and activists and writers were all working for this organization, and it was very influential. And then and she went to work for them, and she was writing for them, and she was editing their journal, the Far Eastern Survey. And it's sort of astonishing that without a college degree, she got to do these things. But she was doing them, and then around 1950, they came under the lens of the House Un-American Activities Committee for being suspected of having communist ties, and they lost a lot of their funding, and she lost her job, and that's when she started playing music. But from an early age, I mean, she moved to New York when she was 19 and started working for this organization shortly thereafter. She was very invested in trying to find solutions for big world problems. This was the work that she returned to when she left New York in 1961, moved to Ann Arbor. She began writing and editing for the Journal of Conflict Resolution. She began lecturing around Ann Arbor about peace and about all kinds of incredible topics. She was an activist against the war, an activist against racism. She joined an organization called People Against Racism, and she was writing very discursive, heavy treatises, manifestos about institutional racism in America and what to do about it in the late 60s, way ahead of her time. So these were some of the things that she was involved in before she disappeared.
Yeah, it's ahead of her time is something that gets repeated often.
Yeah.
I want Howard to be able to sign some books for y'all and to sell some books. Does anyone else want to share anything more?
Yeah.
I just have one more little question. How was she considered by her musical contemporaries in New York? Was she held in high esteem, or was she?
It's very it's a very hard thing to get a handle on, because on the one hand, she didn't have any recordings, she didn't play any concerts, and everybody that I contacted from the sort of pre-Bob Dylan folk world of the 1950s, nobody had ever heard of her. But she was playing these house concerts. and being recorded by people in an amateur way. And early on in my research, and I'll try to wrap this up. How are we doing on time, by the way?
You can wrap it up.
Okay. Okay. I'll just tell this last thing, and then we'll wrap it up. Early in my research, when I contacted this guy Gene Deitch, and I went to Prague to talk with him, he said, you know, everybody is gone from those days, but you could try to contact this woman, Barbara Bernal. And I contacted Barbara, and she told me what it was like to sit and listen to Connie Converse. And then she said, oh, you know, there's this other couple that I remember who used to be at those salons. You should give them a try. I haven't talked to them in many years. And I called up these people. They were in their late 80s, Fred and Julie Crippen. And I said, do you remember going to hear Connie Converse at Gene Deitch's house? And Julia Crippen said, oh, yes. And she started singing one of Connie Converse's songs to me over the phone, Playboy of the Western World, word for word. And I said, oh, you must have that recording that came out recently of her stuff from the 50s. She said, no, I didn't know there was a recording. I said, oh, do you have a home recording of her singing this song? She said, no. I said, well, when's the last time you heard this song? She said, 1954. So I said, how is it possible? You're telling me you remember the lyrics to a song you haven't heard in 50-something years? She said she really made an impression on me. And she was not the only person to do this. Somebody else did this on the phone with me with another one of her songs. I also hadn't heard it in 50 years. So my answer to your question is, she made a huge impression on some people. She didn't break through, but I feel like the tendrils, like that, maybe her music somehow got into the ether and influenced the generation that came after her. Who knows?
I have one quick question too, Howard.
Yeah.
Where do you think, in your opinion, she fits into the musical American canon? I
think she's, you know, a significant figure of the 20th century. I think she represents a new reference point in American musical history. She's her own thing, but she, you know, there's part of early jazz, early blues, early country music in her stuff. There's some Broadway influences in there. There's pop music in there. There's experimental stuff. There's classical stuff. There's what would later become known as singer-songwriter stuff. She's in that mix, and yet is her own thing somehow. Yeah. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you both. And thank you all for coming. I get to hold up the book again. They're at the counter and at the table alongside the counter. So I hope you'll pick up a copy. I know you want to find out the whole story. And we're going to clear the radio off the table, and you can sign books.
Okay, cool.
And if you're not on our mailing list, put yourself on there. We've got more great events coming up, so we'll keep you posted. If all you have to do is go to our website and add yourself.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is where I'm doing it.